Welcome back, everybody. Today we're taking a deep dive into the fascinating world of business, but not in the typical way you might expect. We're going to be exploring Simon Sinek's The Infinite Game
Oh, a great choice.
and looking at how viewing business as an infinite game can totally change the way you think about, well, everything.
Yeah.
You sent us some really interesting excerpts from the book, and we're going to break down the key concepts, and we'll, see how it can change the game for you.
It's a really, really interesting concept because I think most of us, if we're honest with ourselves, we think of business as this finite game.
Right.
Somebody wins, somebody loses, somebody gets the deal, somebody doesn't. But Sinek actually argues that thinking about business in that kind of win-lose way can actually hold you back in the long run.
Okay, so then how is business an infinite game? I mean, there are clearly winners and losers all the time, right?
Yeah. But the way to think about it is that finite games, right, they have very clear rules, a set number of players, and there's a defined endpoint. So think, like a football game.
Okay, yeah.
You've got the rules, you've got the teams, and then at the end of the game, there's a clear winner. But infinite games are different.
Okay, so what makes a game infinite then?
Well, the players can change, the rules can change, and there's no finish line. The goal is to keep playing, to keep adapting, keep evolving. And Sinek says that business is much more like an infinite game than a finite game. Your competitors might change, the market conditions change, but the point is to just stay in the game. Stay in the game as long as you can.
So how does changing to this infinite mindset, how does that actually change things? Because at the end of the day, doesn't every business want to win?
Yeah, and that's the thing. Focusing only on winning, especially on those really short-term wins, it can actually stop you from achieving that long-term success. It's like focusing so much on, just capturing one piece on the chessboard that you miss your opponent's checkmate.
I can see how that would happen.
Yeah.
Like you're so obsessed with beating a competitor that you might miss other opportunities, like, innovation, adapting to the market.
Absolutely. A great example that Sinek uses is Microsoft and Apple back when they had those big education summits. Microsoft had that very finite mindset. Their presentations were all about, we're going to crush Apple in education.
And Apple had a different approach.
Totally. Their presentations were all about, their mission, to help teachers teach and students learn. They weren't obsessed with beating Microsoft. They were focused on their own game.
And then there's that story about the Apple executive in the Zune, where Sinek was talking to the executive, and he said something like, Microsoft Zune, it's so much better than the iPod Touch.
Right. It's a perfect example of the infinite mindset because, instead of getting defensive or trying to argue, the Apple executive just says, I have no doubt. It's like they were playing on a whole other level. They weren't threatened by the competition because they were so confident in their own path.
They weren't letting Microsoft define what their moves were going to be.
Huh.
So Sinek talks about this thing called a just cause. Is that kind of like the North Star then for an infinite game player?
It is. It is. Your just cause, it's this specific, idealistic, and kind of ultimately unachievable goal that just guides your actions. It's something that you're constantly striving toward, even though you'll never actually fully reach it.
Okay, so it's more like a guiding principle rather than a specific target. But how does that really work in business? It sounds a bit, lofty.
It can be, but it's incredibly powerful. Think about Nikolai Vavilov. He was this Russian botanist, really fascinating guy who dedicated his life to, ending world hunger.
I've never heard of him.
So he traveled all over the world in the 1920s and 30s collecting seeds, and he created this massive seed bank in Leningrad.
Wow.
He believed that protecting genetic diversity was key to the world's food supply.
What an undertaking, especially back then.
It was. And during World War II, when Leningrad was under siege by the Nazis, Vavilov's team, they faced this impossible choice. The city was starving, and they were surrounded by tons of food.
The seeds.
Yeah, the seeds in their bank.
Oh, wow.
So do they eat the seeds and survive, or do they protect them and risk starvation?
I can see the dilemma there.
And they chose to protect the seeds. They knew that eating them would mean losing this irreplaceable genetic diversity, which would potentially endanger the future of food for everybody.
That's incredible. Did they survive?
Sadly, 9 of Vavilov's scientists, they died of starvation during that siege, surrounded by all this food that they refused to eat.
Oh, wow.
But their sacrifice wasn't in vain. The seed bank survived. And today, there are almost 2,000 seed banks all over the world that are carrying on his work.
That is such a powerful example of a just cause, like in action. Playing the infinite game even when the stakes are incredibly high.
Exactly. They're thinking about the long-term impact of their actions even when they were facing this really immediate hardship. And that's the essence of the infinite game, right?
Yeah.
Making decisions that benefit the future, not just the present.
So I can see how that dedication applies to something like, ending world hunger. But how does that translate into a just cause for a regular business?
Mm.
Like a company that makes, I don't know, shoes.
That's where it gets really interesting. So say you are that shoe company. Your just cause can't just be selling more shoes, right?
Right.
That's a finite game. You either sell more shoes or you don't. You need to connect it to something bigger, something that really inspires people.
So how do you do that?
Maybe your just cause becomes something like creating shoes that empower people to move freely and confidently.
So it's about the impact those shoes are having, not just the shoes themselves.
Yes. And suddenly, you're not just a shoe company anymore.
You're helping people achieve their goals.
Exactly. Explore new possibilities, live their lives to the fullest. And that's a just cause that people can get behind.
It gives more meaning to the work.
Yeah.
Employees are more engaged.
Right.
Customers feel a connection.
Exactly. And you attract investors who believe in that vision, in that just cause.
That's how you start playing the infinite game.
It's moving from this transactional mindset to a transformational mindset.
Yeah, it's not just about selling a product, it's making a difference.
Exactly.
This is a perfect segue then to our next point, which is trust. Sinek says trust is essential for building a strong organization. And he says that in an infinite game, trust actually comes before performance.
Yeah, and that kind of flies in the face of a lot of traditional business thinking where it's all about the numbers, right? Just maximizing efficiency. Yeah, and that kind of flies in the face of a lot of traditional business thinking where it's all about the numbers, right? Just maximizing efficiency.
Yeah, it's easy to fall into that trap. So how can putting trust first actually lead to better performance?
Yeah.
It seems a little counterintuitive.
Well, think about it this way. Have you ever noticed how some people can be completely different depending on the environment they're in? Like you meet somebody at a party and they're super charming and engaging.
Yeah.
And then you see that same person at work and they're totally shut down.
Oh, yeah, totally. Sinek talks about Noah, the hotel worker, right?
Yes. Noah worked at 2 different hotels. In one, he was amazing, going above and beyond for the guests, always cheerful, helpful. And then at the other hotel, he was just going through the motions. Barely made eye contact.
So same person, 2 totally different work experiences. What made the difference?
The leadership. In the hotel where Noah was thriving, the leadership really prioritized creating this culture of trust. Employees felt safe to be themselves, to, take risks, and to know that if they made a mistake, it wouldn't be like the end of the world.
It wasn't about his ability or work ethic. It was the environment that made all the difference. So I guess that makes sense that when people feel trusted and valued, they're more likely to bring their best selves to work.
Totally. They're not afraid to experiment or to share ideas or to go that extra mile, And ultimately, that leads to better results.
Okay, so how do you create that kind of high trust environment? Sinek talks about the Navy SEALs and how they have this really interesting approach to teamwork.
Oh, yeah. The SEALs, they understand that trust is absolutely essential, especially in these high-pressure situations. So their philosophy is basically to prioritize trust over performance.
So even if someone is like a top performer, but they're kind of undermining that team dynamic, they're not a good fit.
Right. They would rather have a team member who might not be the absolute highest performer individually, but who really contributes to that positive, trusting team culture. They even have this term toxic high performers.
Yeah, we've all worked with those types. They might hit their numbers, but they leave a trail of negativity and stress everywhere they go. It's funny because a lot of companies seem to reward that kind of behavior.
And that's the problem with focusing so much on just metrics. You can measure sales, you can track productivity, but how do you measure trust?
Yeah, it's not as tangible.
Yeah. How do you quantify the damage that's done by a toxic team member?
Sinek uses that trust versus performance graph to kind of illustrate this point, right?
It's so simple, but so effective. Ideally, you want everyone to be high on both trust and performance. But if you're forced to choose the SEALs, they say, go with trust.
They're willing to sacrifice a bit of that individual performance in the short term to build that foundation.
Yeah, because ultimately trust is what allows teams to really excel under pressure.
They're playing the infinite game.
Exactly. They're investing in the long-term health and resilience of the team.
Okay, so we've talked about having a strong just cause and building a culture of trust. But what about ethics?
Yeah.
Where does that fit into this framework of the infinite game?
That's where this concept of ethical fading comes in. It's this process where those short-term pressures, those goals, can kind of gradually erode ethical standards within an organization.
It's like the ends justify the means. You're so focused on achieving a certain outcome that you start cutting corners.
Exactly. And it happens so slowly that people don't even realize it's happening. They kind of convince themselves that they're just doing what it takes to win.
Sinek uses the Mylan EpiPen example, right, as this really good example of ethical fading.
Yeah, Mylan, the pharmaceutical company that makes the EpiPen, which is this life-saving device for people with allergies, they raised the price of that device by something like 500% in just a few
It
years.
was a huge scandal.
Yeah.
They were justifying it by saying they were just operating within the rules of the system. Didn't the CEO get these huge bonuses tied to those price increases?
She did, and that's what's so disturbing about ethical fading. Like, people can become so disconnected from the real-world impact of their decisions that they just completely lose sight of these basic ethical principles.
It's like their moral compass slowly fades away.
Yeah.
So how do you combat ethical fading then? Is it just a matter of having a strong code of conduct or doing more ethics training?
Well, those things can help, but Sinek argues that the most powerful antidote to ethical fading is actually having that infinite mindset.
So it goes back to having a strong just cause.
Right. When people are driven by a purpose that's bigger than just, those short-term gains, they're much more likely to make decisions that align with their values.
They're thinking about long-term consequences.
Exactly, not just the bottom line. And it reminds me of Patagonia's Don't Buy This Jacket campaign. They actually encouraged people not to buy their products unless they really needed them.
Yeah, that was brilliant.
And it's such a great example of a company with a really strong ethical foundation actually benefiting from it.
It just reinforced that commitment to sustainability and their just cause of building high-quality products that last.
Mm.
And customers trust them more because of it.
It's not about pretending to be ethical. It's about actually living those values,
Yeah.
even when it might seem counterintuitive, from that traditional business perspective.
It's about playing the infinite game. So we've talked about trust, having a just cause, and being ethically grounded. But what about competition? I mean, isn't that just the nature of business?
It is, but Sinek encourages us to kind of rethink how we approach competition. So instead of viewing other companies as like the enemy that has to be defeated, he introduces this idea of a worthy rival.
Okay, so instead of crush the competition, you view them as what? Like friendly competitors. I'm interested to hear more about this. So instead of crush the competition, you view them as what? Like friendly competitors. I'm interested to hear more about this.
Yeah, it's a little less cutthroat than the typical business rivalry. Think of a worthy rival as a competitor who inspires you to be better.
Okay, so it's not about taking them down.
Right. It's about recognizing their strengths, learning from their successes, and using that to elevate your own game,
That actually makes a lot of sense. I used to get so intimidated by other authors in my field,
Yeah.
especially like the really successful ones. I'd see their books on the bestseller list and feel like I was falling behind.
It's so easy to get caught in that comparison trap.
It is. But I finally realized that instead of viewing them as a threat, I could learn from them. There's this one author, Adam Grant. His work is phenomenal. He's tackling these important topics, reaching a huge audience, and it just made me realize that I could be doing more.
It sounds like he became your worthy rival.
He did.
Right.
And instead of feeling threatened by his success, I started using it as motivation. It pushed me to think more critically about my own work, to try new things, and to really strive for a higher level of impact.
That's a perfect example of how a worthy rival can shift your whole perspective. It's not about envy or competition. It's about using their success as fuel for your own growth.
They're showing you what's possible. And Sinek uses a great example of this with Apple and IBM, right?
Yes. Back in the early 80s, when IBM entered the PC market, everybody thought it was game over for Apple.
Right.
But Apple didn't panic. They actually saw IBM as an opportunity.
Didn't they run that ad in the Wall Street Journal, like welcoming them to the market?
They did. It was brilliant. Instead of attacking IBM, they basically said, hey, this is great news for personal computing. Now even more people are going to have access to this amazing technology.
So they used it as a way to reinforce their own mission, their just cause of making technology accessible to everyone.
Exactly. It's a powerful reminder that competition can actually be a catalyst for innovation and growth. When you view it through that lens of the infinite game, and you contrast that with how BlackBerry reacted when the iPhone came along.
Oh yeah, they completely fumbled that one.
They did that. They tried to copy Apple instead of focusing on what made BlackBerry unique. They lost sight of their own strengths and ended up falling behind.
So having a worthy rival can help you stay true to yourself and your mission, even as the market changes. But what about when the world changes so much that staying true to yourself means having to completely reinvent yourself? Is that even possible for a company?
That's where this idea of existential flexibility comes in. It's the willingness to make these big, even radical changes to advance your just cause, even if it means disrupting your own existing business model.
That's got to be scary, especially for a large company.
It can be. But Sinek argues that it's essential for long-term survival in the infinite game. And he uses Walt Disney as an example.
Oh, this is a great one. Disney was already so successful with his animated films. He had achieved what most people would consider the pinnacle of success, but he wasn't content.
He felt limited by the traditional film format. He had this bigger vision, this dream of creating a place where families could experience, joy and imagination firsthand.
Disneyland.
Exactly. And everybody thought he was crazy. His brother Roy, the bankers, even his close friends thought it was a foolish risk. But Disney was so committed to this vision that he was willing to walk away from everything he had built to make it happen.
He even mortgaged his own house to fund the project.
He did, and it was a huge gamble, but it paid off. Disneyland became this global phenomenon, and it's a testament to that power of existential flexibility.
It's amazing to think that if he hadn't been willing to kind of disrupt his own success, Disneyland might never have existed. It makes you think about those moments in our own lives where we might be clinging to the familiar, even when there's something bigger and more meaningful calling us.
It's a reminder that sometimes you have to let go of what you know to really embrace what's possible.
Which brings us to Kodak, the cautionary tale of what can happen when a company lacks that existential flexibility.
Kodak is such a classic example of a company that was so focused on protecting its existing business that they completely missed the digital revolution. Even though they invented the digital camera.
Wait, Kodak invented the digital camera? No way.
They did. But they were so invested in their film business that they were afraid to really embrace this new technology. They thought it would cannibalize their sales. They were playing a finite game trying to hold on to what they had instead of adapting.
And it ultimately led to their downfall. The very technology they invented ended up disrupting the market they dominated.
It's a stark reminder that clinging to the past can be a recipe for disaster in the infinite game. You have to be willing to evolve to disrupt yourself, even when it's uncomfortable.
So what does all of this mean for us, for our own lives and careers? How do we actually apply these concepts of the infinite game?
It starts with a mindset shift. Recognizing that the goal isn't to win, but to keep playing, to keep learning, to keep growing.
And to define our own just cause, something bigger than ourselves that gives our work meaning and purpose.
Exactly. And to build that culture of trust in our teams, to embrace worthy rivals as sources of inspiration, and to have the courage to make those existential flexes when we need to.
This has been such an eye-opening deep dive. I'm already thinking about how I can apply these principles to my own work and life. It's a reminder that the journey is just as important as the destination.
Maybe even more so.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Simon Sinek's The Infinite Game, I want to leave you with this thought. What would Kodak do? And more importantly, what will you do differently, knowing that the game never really ends? Thanks for joining us.
Yeah.